Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 5th of December 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. We'd also like to welcome the BBC. We've reason to believe that we will have some special BBC viewers for today's news. That's always encouraging. We'll come on to that in just a moment.
Well, we put this up yesterday, that it's a done deal, Brian, over the divorce agreement over the European Union. But apparently it's not quite as done as we thought because, well, we were saying yesterday that the Northern Ireland border is going to be used as the excuse for a customs partnership. That still seems to be the case, although the DUP wasn't too happy with the way that this was coming about, apparently, allegedly. So they've put the kibosh on it. And of course, Theresa May in such a weak position at the moment, absolutely relying on the DUP to prop up her pathetic administration, that she has to do what they say.
Blackmail.
Yeah, well, yes, in a sense, absolutely. So we'll come on in detail to that in a moment. But before we do that, we thought we should have a look at what the BBC was doing about Brexit.
We did, indeed. And here's BBC webpage from a little bit earlier this morning. So we've got May fights to save Brexit deal after DUP backlash. But what caught my attention was this little thing to the right of the main headline here. And what does it say? Well, it says bamboozled by Brexit. Let's have a look at it. As talks stall, we get back to basics with this recap of what's happened so far. So I was very intrigued. I was very intrigued with the style of the graphic on this, because to me the figure on the right is the woman. The figure on the left is the man. She's being pulled towards the man. But we've got half the Union Jack, and then we've got the European flag, and then we've got a funny little heart graffiti. I'm always very interested by images because a lot of money is paid by the people who create them. And I thought this was slightly reminiscent of stuff going back to the Soviet era, where there's meaning in the image. But maybe that was just me, Mike.
Well, there's no knee touching going on, I noticed, but definitely the impression you're given is that the EU is being drawn towards the UK, isn't that? That seems to be what's going on there.
Yeah, I think some real thought went into that, but we could be wrong. But when I started to delve deeper into this, I came across a lady called Sofia Betiza. And she tweeted out this: removing ourselves from the outer world to film a #Brexit video with @Adam Fleming. Well, this is fascinating. Removing ourselves from the real world to film a CBBC Brexit propaganda piece. Viewers and listeners will understand why we're putting that in pretty early, but on the camera, it indicates they've already done over 15 hours filming. That's the elapsed time on the side of the camera. So this was a lot of money went into this. Here's the happy couple. And now we've got a tweet from Adam Fleming. He said, I've made a video about #Brexit with @Sofia Betiza, which accidentally looks like a rom-com. Now, I will admit to viewers that I had to ask you, Mike, what a rom-com was, and apparently it's a romantic comedy. So we've got a BBC Brexit documentary which has accidentally become a romantic comedy. I find this fascinating as to the background. Image, again, I find very interesting. We've got the man standing up solidly with the European Union flag, and then nestled against him in a silly little girl posture is the silly little girl waving the Union Jack. Don't know whether there's symbology in that, but it did just catch my eye. So as usual, the UK column did our homework. We went to have a look at the people, and here's the young lady. There's a lot about her. She did a master's in international journalism at City University. She lives between London and Brussels, and she worked at the European Parliament and at the European Commission. So this lady isn't really a citizen of UK. She's really a citizen of the European Union. She's worked in the European Union. I think she's Italian with a little bit of Croatian, I think, in her. She's an internationalist.
Yes.
An internationalist who's worked for the European Union. So my first question is she independent in making this report, or is she biased towards the European Union?
Well,
we don't know, do we?
know, no.
Well, what about the lover, so to speak? Here's Adam Fleming, and of course, he became very big in BBC. So this is children's television.
The children's news.
Children's news in particular, Newsround. And as I've indicated there, was very big on the fact he'd been to America, Mike, and he'd been able to eat some really wonderful pizza in Chicago.
Good stuff.
So this is good stuff. This is teaching British children how to eat properly. It's giving them politics. This is all good. If you want to have a look at a little bit more, you can have a look at Daily and Sunday Politics, because he started to move up in the world. And then we found this, which I found fascinating, because here he is tweeting out that he's been able to help decorate the EU Council's Christmas tree while waiting for foreign ministers to arrive. So he's the Brussels reporter. And I'm going to say I was very clever because I found this out myself, Mike.
Yes.
You'll understand that comment a little bit later. But as with all love affairs, there's often trouble. There is another woman. So let's meet the other woman in this love affair. It's this lady, Suzanne van Hoymissen, and she's based in Brussels, worked with the BBC, done work with the European Union. So I asked the same question, is this woman independent?
Is there any independence?
We don't know. So if our viewers and listeners are curious as to what we're talking about, we thought the only way to analyse this BBC video is to actually watch it. And then we'll make some comments.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. In Brexit, there were two things happening at exactly the same time.
There are people in Europe making big decisions about their lives. I've been speaking to some of them.
And there are negotiations happening in Brussels, which I've been following the whole time.
So that we can help you make sense of all of this.
Breakfast, Brexit, Northern Ireland.
Brexit's going to be a wonderful thing.
Oh, excuse.
Right, now, Trump. They've got Trump in at the very beginning. Brexit is going to be a wonderful thing. And then we've got Theresa May going, and
Yep.
there's some clever psychology going on
This
there.
is an immensely clever piece of video work. This is really designed to play on people's minds. You've got the very flashy photography, but who is the man saying that Brexit is a good thing? Well, it's Trump, the man that the BBC just berates time after time after time. If Trump says everything, it's fake news, it's wrong, it's extremist, it's racist. So they use Trump to put the message across that Brexit is a good thing. And in fact, what that is doing is turning people off that message. And then we follow it up by the Prime Minister not giving a clear message, but focusing on the cough, as you say.
Right. So the first comment in the chat box is this aimed at 6-year-olds? I would say very well done. We're getting there, but it gets worse. So let's go on.
This is a serious business.
That was really confusing.
What actually happens depends on what's agreed between the two sides. Who is making those decisions? Well, meet Michel Barnier. He's the chief negotiator for the remaining 27 EU countries.
And that is David Davis. He's the politician representing the UK government.
They've been talking since June the 19th, and here is how they've been doing it. First of all, they had to decide how to get divorced, and that came down to 3 big issues.
Number 1,
Citizens' rights. Basically, what happens to EU nationals living in Britain now and British people living in the rest of the EU.
number 2,
Money.
and number 3.
The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
So just 3 things, Mike.
Yes, well, they're only talking about the divorce because they've simplified, dumbed this down to such an extent that we're only talking about one very small aspect of Brexit, but we're giving the impression this is the whole story.
Right, and they put together video clip, which is confusing because it's simply flashing images of people kissing each other in face paint, very fast-moving images, which are going to be confusing because nobody can focus on them. They then describe it as terribly confusing and talking as if they're talking to an audience of children. They are going to explain the issues which they think are the key 3 issues. So this is very cleverly crafted. Somebody has asked, has this come straight out of the government's applied behavioural psychology, the so-called nudge unit? Well, if it hasn't, it's got all the hallmarks of very cleverly crafted propaganda.
Citizens' rights is really worrying for some people. I've spoken to those who are already making life-changing decisions since the referendum vote. Listen to this.
We no longer feel welcome, and whatever ends up happening with the negotiations, you can't take that back. The damage is done. I personally was stopped in front of Waterloo Station by an elderly gentleman who was offended that I was speaking Bulgarian on the phone. He whacked me with his walking stick on the ankle and continued on.
I feel lost. If the freedom to travel across the EU and the ability to work everywhere is withdrawn for UK citizens living here, like me, then I effectively can't work. So I've applied for Belgian citizenship, which should hopefully be granted in the coming weeks. This isn't what the EU is supposed to be about.
I've been living in limbo for the past 18 months. We have decided, me and my British husband, to leave the UK and move to the Netherlands. We built our home here. And now, because of this uncertainty, we feel that we're sort of pushed out. I leave my friends and family over here and the love of this country, which is gone.
So we are to believe that there's only one side to this discussion on the free movement of people, because they've only interviewed people that are taking a negative view of the restrictions on free movement of people. And the presentation is that people are now disillusioned with Britain. The love for the country is gone because of the Brexit vote. Where's the balance in this? This is the most unbelievable pro-EU bias and propaganda.
And what does the woman say? That she was hit? Well, actually, she's saying she was assaulted. That people actually are so aggressive over this subject that they're assaulting people in the street. That's the inference. If she was hit by a man in the street with a stick, presumably she went to the police, but I don't think the BBC are going to be covering that. So as you say, huge bias here. Let's remember, over 17 million people voted to leave the European Union. It's as if that vote never took place. Those people never have a voice in this BBC video. But let's go on.
The UK says they can apply for something called settled status, which basically means if you're in Britain now, you can probably stay in Britain. The EU wants a role for the European Court of Justice and for EU nationals to be able to bring family members with them automatically. Things the British government isn't too sure about. Until those disagreements are solved, the whole issue isn't solved.
And then there's another big divorce issue, the money. And that's money that the EU wants from the UK.
Okay, this is what Theresa May has said about this so far.
The UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership. I do not want our partners to fear that they will need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave.
Effectively, what she's saying is that the UK will pay into the EU for a couple of years after it's left so that their budget isn't messed up.
For a couple of years, Brian, he has no evidence whatsoever that it's only going to be a couple of years. So that is, again, an attempt to, misrepresent the realities of the situation. We were talking last week about 40 to 50 billion pounds going to the European Union post-Brexit, but there was absolutely no suggestion. In fact, it was argued against that would be paid as a single payment. That was going to be paid over significantly longer than 2 years, possibly 4 or 5 years. So this is misrepresentative.
People also picking up on the fact that this is delivered in this most unbelievably condescending way. Who is the audience? Now, this is on the front page of the BBC's website. It's next to the headline article to do with Brexit and Theresa May. There is no indication that this is for children. And of course, the reason for that is it's not meant for children. This, as somebody else has already commented, is designed for a heavily dumbed down audience. But I think they are targeting younger people. So maybe we've got people, teenagers, late teens or into their early 20s who probably are used to some of the news round stuff. This is to drag their mind further into the gutter. but it's very, very cleverly put together.
Also saying the UK is okay with the idea of paying for some things it signed up to as a member.
But some Brits feel they were lied to because they say this divorce bill was never really mentioned during the referendum campaign.
I voted for Brexit and I didn't expect there to be a massive divorce bill, and it makes me feel quite angry that the European Union are trying to foist this quite unreasonable sum on the British taxpayer and the British voter.
Well, Archie, I think the EU would argue the UK has made promises it's got to live up to.
So that was a very, very clever little thing there. We've had 3 people speaking out for the European Union. It's terrible, they might have to move, that they're feeling very unsettled. I've been hit on the leg with a stick. We then have somebody who says, well, actually, I'm not happy with these arrangements, but that's a single person. What do the BBC team then do? They undermine that comment.
Yes, you said a little boy, Archie.
You got it wrong.
Yes.
You got it wrong, Archie. We, the BBC, are going to tell you what you really meant. So we've got the bias in the number of people put forward. We've got bias in that when somebody speaks out with a perfectly legitimate concern about what's wrong, the BBC step in to cut the ground out from under them.
UK would say, who pays a bill without checking whether they're being diddled or not? Oh, by the way, Sophia, we might not even get a final number until the very end of all of this.
And there's one last big divorce issue. What will happen to the border that divides Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is, of course, its own country and is part of the EU?
Nobody wants a hard border with security or customs checks between the 2 countries. Agreeing that was easy. Working out the details, much, much harder.
And because of this uncertainty, some people don't want to wait around and are planning ahead, like David here.
I farm just along the border. If I'm restricted in doing that, it will affect my business. I know agricultural businesses, selling sprays and fertilisers, they are now looking about starting a business in the Republic, and the businesses in the Republic starting a business in the north to keep their customers. But it's all extra costs, so it doesn't make business sense.
And finally, that brings us to what's known as Phase 2. After the divorce, the 2 sides need to work out their future relationship. A big part of that is about trade. The UK wants buying and selling things from and to the EU to be as simple as it is now. The EU says you only get that by staying in the club. So guess what? There's a whole other set of talks to sort it out.
So still, no one knows what kind of a deal on trade they're going to create, which means that a lot of businesses are having to make big decisions.
Since the referendum, Brexit has caused many uncertainties within our company. We've had to look at making our facilities to produce the food and drink items away from Europe and in the UK, because producing in Europe is going to become a lot more expensive as soon as Brexit occurs.
So when will Bobby know what's going to happen?
Well, there's probably going to be a period of a couple of years where things stay roughly the same to give business time to adjust.
And what about all the other people I spoke to? When will everyone know for sure?
October 2018. That's when they want the deal to be done so it can be voted on by the European Parliament and the UK Parliament.
And of course, there's a chance they might not even get a deal at all.
That's a whole other video.
So it's all about uncertainty. It's all about uncertainty. Business can't be certain. Nothing about opportunity. Nothing about the fact that actually business is going on quite happily in the meantime. And of course, if we look at the broader media coverage of this, we've got, including the BBC today, articles about how the service sector is slowing down, and that's being blamed by the BBC and other mainstream media on Brexit. They've no evidence whatsoever to suggest that that is a Brexit-related issue, but in this video, they absolutely ram home the idea that all this uncertainty is causing problems for the business
causing
community.
Problems for the farmer. So the farmer, who I'm sure works extremely hard there in Northern Ireland to run his farm and make a living, he's used as a political tool to emphasise the case that this is all disruption and it's causing him problems. Bobby, who is Bobby? Not quite sure what Bobby's done. We don't get any introduction. Appy Food and Drink. Who is Bobby? And then what does the lady say? She says, all the other people I have spoken to. But of course, out of the 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union for very, very good and well-argued reasons, there's been no BBC interview or interaction at all. So we have watched this video several times to make sure that what we think is happening. A most incredible piece of bias reporting from the BBC I think I've ever seen. And of course the final insult is that if you dare to have a different opinion to the BBC's pro-European Union position, you need to be spoken to as a child so that you can really understand from the BBC what should happen. Well, we contacted the BBC. We asked to be able to speak to one or both of those two journalists before the news today. What happened as usual, the BBC put up a firewall effectively. Here's the reply we got. Hi Brian, please find here our statement in response to your query. Now the query was actually that we wanted comment from the journalists themselves. So the first thing the BBC does is obfuscate and fails to answer the question. Then it says BBC spokesperson said, so this is an anonymous person, this is an impartial issue explainer. We continue to report on Brexit developments in an impartial way. For background only, it would be wrong to characterise this video as a representation of our coverage of Brexit. This is an explainer which is aimed at a broader audience who may not necessarily have an in-depth knowledge of the subject. As talks appear to have broken down, the video explains some of the key issues of the Brexit divorce and meet some of the people affected by the politics. This is just some of our extensive coverage of Brexit. Adam Fleming is the BBC Brussels correspondent. And that's the reason I flagged that little comment up at the beginning, because I'm glad the BBC told me, because otherwise I would have no idea who Mr. Fleming was. So don't expect the BBC to stand up and be counted. If you try to even speak to the journalists who produce this highly biased information, then the BBC is going to protect them behind a massive media firewall. Pretty sickening stuff, Mike.
Yes, so let's get back to this done deal or not. The UK and the EU have failed to reach this agreement, apparently because of the DUP. They broke down after the talks broke down after the DUP would not accept what many mainstream outlets were describing as concessions on the issue of the Northern Irish border. So the Irish Prime Minister said, I'm surprised and disappointed that the British government now appears not to be in a position to conclude what we had agreed earlier in the day. And so Theresa May is in a bit hot water, bit of difficulty over this with the DUP. But the DUP have said in no uncertain terms that they will not accept any legislation which separates Northern Ireland from the UK. In other words, the rules cannot be different between Northern Ireland and the UK. So is this going to stop Brexit in its tracks, or is there something else going on here? Well, the DUP apparently objected to a clause in the draft agreement. That draft agreement was it leaked? I'm not certain, but the Irish press managed to get their hands on it, and this is why the whole thing broke down in the afternoon yesterday. And this was going to guarantee what was being described as regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So what they were going to do was say that basically Northern Ireland would stay within the customs union somehow and within the single market, so the border could stay open. But then Northern Ireland would have the same rules as the Republic of Ireland and different rules to the rest of the UK. And so clearly that was going to cause a problem. I'll just remind everybody that Tony Blair the other day said that this was going to be a problem. And, you know, what we cannot have, he says, and what everybody else says, is that we cannot have this stirring up sectarian problems in Northern Ireland again. We don't want to see us going back to the days of some kind of IRA action. So this is really important. Well, we'll leave it to the Norwegian foreign minister to explain what's really going on here, because what she's saying is, well, to quote her here, we could, of course, replace the single market with a free trade agreement. But the point is that what gives us all the benefits is that we have a common regulatory framework. And the point she was making was that as whatever the free trade agreement or whatever agreement is made between the UK and the European Union as we move through this Brexit process, that the terms and conditions of that agreement would mean that Britain's law with regard to trade would have to move in sync with the EU's law in regard to trade. And this is why the so-called Great Repeal Bill, the first thing it does is to put all the EU's legislation onto the British statute books, because it's exactly as we've been saying in the column for quite some time now, as we move forward from Brexit, our law is going to have to stay in sync with the European Union's law, at least in the areas where we have agreements. So that might mean the common security policy, it might mean Europol, it might mean and European arrest warrants, it might mean aviation safety, Euratom, all these various institutions that we're apparently going to opt into. Along with those opt-ins is going to come a requirement for the UK's statute book to stay in sync with the European Union's statute book. And that's what we've been saying from the beginning. That's why one of the reasons why we said that this is really a psyop. It's not really happening in the way that it's being presented, and the 17 million Brexit voters are being sold a pup. So let's move on. Completely different subject now, Brian. This is a spectacular piece of news because Google has decided that it's going to put 10,000 staff onto tackling extremist content online. Now, extremist content, at the moment they're talking about violent videos, extremist terrorist videos and so on YouTube. They're saying that they will dedicate more than 10,000 staff to rooting out violent extremist content in 2018 on YouTube. They said that YouTube is going to make sure that any videos which mislead, manipulate, harass or even harm people are going to be removed. And they're going to provide their customers with curated content from now on. So the question then is that going to be limited to what's viewed as violent extremism, or is that going to creep into other areas? Perhaps
the danger is, Mike, that of course the definition of violent extremism has been coming out of the government or governments, because we say it's not just UK governments, we could say it's the US government as well, and the definition becomes ever broader. So we're now at the point that if you dare to come out with an opinion which doesn't agree with what the British government is doing, you're automatically being flagged up as a potential domestic extremist. Later you'll move into the potential domestic terrorist bracket. So where is an organisation like YouTube getting the policy from? Well, the policy is coming in through the, I'm going to say, the world political system. And this is immensely dangerous, because it will only get broader. There will be more and more definitions of what domestic extremism is.
Well, it is coming in from the world political establishment, but let's remember that it was David Cameron that took the point on this with his speech at the United Nations a few years ago. Theresa May has taken up the baton, and she is absolutely driving this forward. She was calling Google and the others, Facebook and Twitter, into number 10 Downing Street, and she, alongside Australia and a couple of other countries, but it's her mainly taking point on this. So it is being driven through Britain.
Yeah.
So where do we go, Melanie?
Well, where do we go is we'll come on to what Britain is like, and I'm going to once again put Melanie Shaw's face on screen, and I'm going to ask again, and I'm going to keep asking, that people do take the trouble to write to this lady. What is happening to this woman is utterly wicked. This is Theresa May's Conservative Britain in 2017. So Melanie Shaw in prison. She does not know the full details of what she's been convicted for. She has no release date, and she is being treated in the most appalling way. Why? Because of the knowledge she has of the British government's involvement in the abuse of children. So we think it is worth a little bit of your time to write a letter and or send a Christmas card, and you can freeze the screen and have a look at the address on screen yourself.
Okay. The Bank for International Settlements has released its latest quarterly report, and they're pretty unequivocal that the global financial system situation is pretty dangerous at the moment. They're saying that record high asset prices, stock market and so on, also what they describe as unsustainable domestic and foreign currency debt levels, also consumer credit, consumer debt levels at unprecedented levels. So their head of monetary and economic, their monetary and economic department, Claudio Borio, had this to say: the vulnerabilities that have built up around the globe during the unusually long period of unusually low interest rates have not gone away. As underlined in this quarterly review's special features, high debt levels in both domestic and foreign currency are still there, and so are frothy valuations, in turn underpinned by low government bond yields, the benchmark for pricing of all assets. What's more, the longer the risk-taking continues, the higher the underlying balance sheet exposures may become. Short-run calm comes at the expense of possible long-run turbulence. What he has been saying, of course, Mark Carney has been saying as well, and even some traders are commenting on it. So this is from the Telegraph. Neil Woodford says markets are a bubble, which are inevitably going to burst. Yes, thank you. He went on. He said quite a lot more. What's interesting that he hasn't actually doesn't seem to have done too much to withdraw his own organisation from those markets that he's concerned about. But the truth is, this is another voice from the financial establishment, quite a senior, well-known voice, highlighting the serious problems that are coming down the road. And, well, you've got to ask, when it does happen the next time, are we going to get politicians saying, well, nobody saw it coming? This is the kind of thing they said in the previous. But don't worry. Anybody that's thinking that they can run off the Bitcoin and everything's going to be okay may have another thing coming, because following the Fed, the Treasury has now decided that Bitcoin is of major concern to them. They're worried that people are going to launder money through it, that it's a tax dodge, and so they're going to what they're describing as crack down on Bitcoin. So we watch this with interest to see what they actually do. Okay. Sustainability and transformation partnerships. Brian, this is all about the National Health Service, and this is the House of Commons Health Committee, which is resuming an inquiry into sustainability and transformation plans, now partnerships. This inquiry had started before the general election, but it was cut short by the general election. They've restarted it again. So they're saying that sustainability and transformation partnerships cover all of England. In each STP area, local NHS organisations and councils have drawn up proposals to improve health and care in the areas they serve. The NHS England document Next Steps on the NHS Forward View, published earlier this year, says that STPs began life as pragmatic vehicles for enabling health and care organisations within an area to chart their own way to keeping people healthier for longer, improving care, reducing health inequalities and managing their money, working jointly on behalf of people that they serve, and so it goes on. And as I read on down through the release that they made on this inquiry, the thing that sort of came to my mind, Brian, was, are we actually talking about the path to privatisation? So I decided we're going to have a look and see whether other people were suggesting that. And in fact, I've just chosen this one NHS campaign. This is Calderdale and Kirklees 999 call for the NHS, and they're saying exactly that. The headline there, it's a bit hard to read because it's in grey. Sustainability and transformation plans are a massive vehicle for NHS privatisation. And they're saying that the sustainability and transformation funding that the government announced in its 2015 comprehensive spending review comes with the condition that it's used to increase opportunities for the private sector in the NHS. This was made clear in NHS England's initial STP planning guidance in December 2015, which said that the independent sector should play a key role in helping individual footprints to make the stated requirements for STPs and in ensuring that plans are effectively delivered. You will not find this mentioned in any STPs, nor will clinical commissioning groups acknowledge it. If Calderdale Clinical Commissioning Group's chief officer has anything to go by, questioned by the Calderdale Health and Wellbeing Board's 25th of August meeting, he said he didn't recognise the requirement for STPs to encourage NHS privatisation. But of course, this phrase recognise Brian, is rolled out by politicians and public servants and others when they don't want to say that you're right and they don't want to say that you're wrong, because if they said that you're wrong, they would be lying. So they use the word recognise to try and
put
imply.
a screen up,
yes,
effectively.
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed.
So, of course, money, the lack of money is apparently the reason we have to cut the NHS. The NHS needs to be privatised because that will make it more efficient. Probably not. But the big lie is always that there is no money. Money created from nothing by the international banking cartel. So all of this could be rectified very quickly. The moment people recognise that we've got a criminal cartel running the world's monetary system. But at the moment, the big lie is no money, means no education, no health, and it also means, of course, no defence. So this is the key message at the moment. Russia is a big threat. This is what the government is telling the UK population. Those nasty Russians are definitely going to invade Europe. So the sensible thing for Theresa May's Conservative government is now to cut the Royal Marines and amphibious units, and that is definitely on the cards. We've been warning about this for some time. I've just brought in an allegedly over the threat because, of course, this is a big propaganda exercise. The cuts to Britain's military are going to be made, nothing to do with the fact there's no money. The cuts are going to be made in order that UK is fully locked into the EU unified military structure, which includes procurement, it includes the build of military equipment, and it, of course, is all part of the move through to the UK, to the EU's treasury. So one big lie, but we know there are more cuts coming, and we have been warning and warning. The other thing that's been happening is a complete breakdown inside the armed services. So things which are really unthinkable, certainly 20 years ago, we've now got whole classes of warships appearing to be non-operational. This is the great Type 45s. Remember, these are the ships, over £1 billion each, and they were going to dominate the world stage, but they did have a little snag. They couldn't operate in warm water. So HMS Diamond has come back to UK early because they've got mechanical problems. The captain says, well, don't worry, because it was lovely to come back and see all our families on the jetty. Well, I'm sure it was, but the point is that this ship has now joined all of the other ships in the class, and they've all got big problems. And yet we have local MPs like Johnny Mercer, ex-army himself, but clearly this man is either totally ignorant of what's really going on in defence, or he's been deliberately kept in the dark by the Tory party. He says, I know I can go on about defence, but this is why I feel so passionate about it. But he doesn't say anything of any credibility. And then, of course, we got the Conservative Party itself getting very panicky because information about these defence cuts is leaking out into the public domain. What have they got to do? They've got to plug those leaks. They've got to silence people. And they've also got to call their own MPs in for a nice little discussion behind closed doors to tell them that they need to get control of their constituents, keep pulling the wool over their eyes, make sure in a place like Plymouth with Devonport Dockyard that people locally still can't see the truth, that the Tories are going to decimate Britain's defence industry and armed forces in order to help build the European system. And that, of course, is perfectly possible because, as Mike has just pointed out, Brexit is a complete lie, and the future agenda is that we're fully locked into the European Union. Well, if you want to know more about this, there's going to be a debate this afternoon in Westminster, the Royal Marines and UK Amphibious Capability Inquiry. Not debated in Parliament. This is just a little committee room debate. They take evidence from the usual think tanks that want the cuts anyway. It will be televised, so you can see it. But here we go again, Mike. This is the military being decimated, and the Tory party simply lying and lying again to the public.
Well, today, Brian, is the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting taking place at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Let's see what Jens Stoltenberg had to say about that.
Good morning. This week, NATO's foreign ministers will address a long, wide range of different issues, and they will address how NATO can continue to adapt, and that's part of our preparations for the upcoming summit here in Brussels next July. We will begin tomorrow with a meeting on NATO-EU cooperation and European defence.
Okay, so all those members of Parliament that have been writing to our viewers and listeners and other concerned citizens concerned that Britain is being brought into the unified EU military structures, who have said in response, no, Britain is all about NATO, it's not about the EU at all. Well, here we have yet another meeting where Jens Stoltenberg and Federica Mogherini will be getting together. I'm not sure who's going to be on top, but they're going to be getting together to discuss NATO-EU relations. This is a foreign ministers meeting, so Boris Johnson must be there. So he is clearly in agreement with what's going on. Yeah. Well, let's just look at this in a bit more detail. So NATO foreign ministers are going to seek to increase cooperation with the European Union during the two-day meeting in Brussels. 11 o'clock this morning, they were having a briefing and discussion on NATO-EU cooperation. That was open to all accredited journalists. So I wait with interest to see what the UK mainstream media does to cover this, because I'll be very surprised if there's any major UK media coverage of this at all. And then this evening at 6:15, there'll be a joint press conference by Jens Stoltenberg and Federica Mogherini on this issue. NATO ministers, said Stoltenberg, are able to focus on the core task, on the job we have to do despite any speculation and rumours. I'm absolutely certain that this will be the case also now, because we have so much important work ahead of us, for instance, addressing how we can respond to a more challenging and dangerous security environment. So, this is the excuse that's being used for this closer cooperation between NATO and the EU. But, it is interesting that in the UK there's almost no coverage of it except for on the UK column.
Just on the UK column, the BBC, of course, utter silence. And you're going to bring in this one?
We absolutely will, yes. So, as you say, the defence meeting happening today, but there is some comment from Tony Douglas, who's the head of the MOD and the civil service, this sort of senior civil servant in charge of procurement of military equipment, and he's concerned about the continuing cuts. He said, "I will speak as a British passport holder and someone who's passionate as anyone else in the room. If it was my money, I would give the Ministry of Defence more because defence needs it." But of course, that isn't going to happen.
That is going to happen. And we're going to end on this, which is a serious note, but the Telegraph reporting, that the International Criminal Court is saying that it is going to target British servicemen and women. This is to do with Iraq. So although the government's Iraq inquiry was totally discredited, we had solicitors making up information that was pushed through, and a lot of money with payouts and fees changing hands. Many people thought the whole thing was going to die away, but now the ICC has picked it up and says, they could well be targeting British servicemen and women for alleged crimes out in Iraq. And I just wanted to put Tony Blair's picture on screen, because, of course, they're not going to go for the people who've created all this stuff in the first place. So although we've had a death in one of the international criminal courts recently, a suicide, in fact, as a result of 13 years of pressure, men like Tony Blair, well, it doesn't really matter, does it, Mike?
No, apparently not.
It doesn't. Well, we will end on the note of a big thank you to all the people who responded to my plea. Could people who are watching UK Column for free please consider making a donation? And as Mike said yesterday, we're really delighted with the response we've had for that. Apparently, I was a little bit sharp with a few people, but I'm afraid the time's come. We can only do what we do with your help. So if you are still one of the viewers who are watching and you haven't yet decided to take up a subscription, if you would do that, it would help us, and we can then get more news out. And of course, we do many other things alongside the news. So people who've been in difficult situations, we've helped. We're still, of course, still trying to help Melanie Shaw as just one example. But all of this takes a certain amount of financial commitment, and we can only do it with financial help from yourselves. The UK Column pens are starting to move, so if you haven't yet got this excellent weapon, the pen being mightier than the sword, perhaps you consider putting in a order for some UK Column pens. We said what an excellent Christmas present. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.